Coming up next, in-depth news analysis. You're listening to Korea 24 from KBS World Radio.
Despite North Korea citing anti-Pyongyang leaflet campaigns as the trigger to the recent rise in cross-border tensions, a defector group in South Korea once again secretly sent over the border a fresh batch of propaganda materials on Monday night. The group is now widely expected to face criminal charges, as the Unification Ministry in Seoul said they'll be sternly dealt with, and the governor of Gyeonggi province says he requested police to look into the activities on suspicions of fraud and misappropriation. So the government is going all out to stop the defectors from further worsening the situation with the North. But human rights activists still say the defectors' right to free speech should be respected. Does the South Korean government have the right to curtail these rights for its North Korea policy and its peace initiative? To discuss that, we have two guests with us today. First, we have Signe Poulsen, head of the Seoul office of the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's good to have you back on the show again.
Thank you.
And we also have with us Benedict DeDominicis, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Catholic University of Korea. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Pyongyang has cited the leaflets as a major reason for its recent decision to blow up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office and increase military presence on the border. Whether one believes that or not is the main reason or not. The South Korean government is coming down fairly strictly on the defector groups carrying out these activities. Ms. Poulsen, what has been your and your office's take on this situation?
Well, the right to freedom of speech includes also the right to receive information, to impart information through different means and across borders, and that's enshrined in international human rights standards. In particular, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which both South and North Korea, in fact, have ratified or signed on to. Within that right, though, are responsibilities and limitations that can be imposed, such as for security reasons. That's a fairly obvious one. And so when the Seoul or the government of South Korea talks about limiting the sending of leaflets, these are the kinds of restrictions they would be referring to as a country that broadly upholds human rights standards and has a functioning judicial system. These measures have indeed been tried through the courts in the past a couple of years ago. What's important is that you cannot have a flat-out restriction. It has to be necessary and it has to be proportionate. So within certain limitations, to secure its population, certain steps can be taken. I think from the Human Rights Office, what we would always encourage is a dialogue with these organizations who are sending leaflets, so that we can explore what the best way or what the ways of getting information into North Korea are. Because, of course, from a North Korean perspective, the lack of access to information by the population is highly problematic.
So you're saying right now, although South Korea does have the right for security reasons to try and perhaps limit these kinds of activities, you're saying the way Seoul is going about it perhaps might be disproportionate.
That's for courts to decide in the end. But certainly, regardless of what
you
happens...
have concerns about those, right?
What happens in the judicial system, there are a number of other things that can happen in parallel with a genuine dialogue with civil society organizations, some thinking about how do we keep this engagement with North Korea going, and how do we also include a human rights discourse within those engagement efforts, for example.
Professor, what's your take on this?
Well, it's an emerging crisis, but it's a crisis that we've been expecting with the freezing of diplomacy after Trump's U.S. President Trump's personal engagement and not leading anywhere. Beyond the maximum statement of demands that of complete and irreversible and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea, and nothing more gone beyond that. And the North Koreans have gone back to their source of bargaining leverage, which is in diplomacy, which is the threat of escalating crisis, which is the reason why they developed the nuclear weapon capability in the first place, is to make the danger of uncontrolled escalation more dangerous worse for everybody involved, which is the reason why the world is talking to them, because they have the nuclear weapons. So if it's this leaflet issue has been chosen as the issue around which to generate a crisis, but it could be anything. It just happens to be that case. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence as well. Also, that the North Koreans have moved at this point, given the weakening of U.S. President Trump domestically in the United States, that his domestic situation is deteriorating. He's more likely than not to not be reelected, and he knows this, and consequently, it increases North Korea's bargaining leverage over South Korea, over Seoul, because South Korea's the Seoul's government's likelihood of being able to expect the United States backup in a crisis with North Korea might be more questionable. So I think North Korea's leveraging the situation to try to get more economic resources out of the Seoul government.
That's the overall situation here with the two Koreas and the United States. What's your concern? Do you have any concerns about how the South Korean government has been dealing with the situation concerning the leaflets? I understand the leaflets might not be the real reason why the two countries are having this escalated tension and the situation right now, but it is becoming an issue here in South Korea. What's your take on this? The South Korean leaflet issue reflects, I think, the South Korean government's view that North Korean motivations for their behavior are complex, but overall the dominant motivation for North Korean behavior is regime maintenance. They want to maintain the regime. They don't want to win the Korean War. They don't want to conquer South Korea. They want to maintain the regime. And economic reform is problematic insofar as if the North Koreans follow the East German approach, we know what happened with East Germany, and we all know what will happen with North Korea if they follow that approach. So they want economic resources to maintain the regime. The South Korean government seems to recognize that is their motivation. Hence, they're more willing to talk and deal sternly with the North Korean defectors sending the leaflets over to indicate to the North Korean government that they are sympathetic. Well, they're not sympathetic, but that they understand that they're concerned about the stability of their regime, and they're also trying to appeal to global public opinion insofar as they want to appear to be that they too want stability on the Korean Peninsula. But I think it always reflected Moon Jae-in's administration approach that they think that North Korea's motivations are not fundamentally to dominate the Korean Peninsula, but they see a threat from the outside world. Ms. Poulsen, shouldn't the principle of non-intervention be applied to the current case when it comes to the leaflet campaigns and these defector groups and what they're doing?
Well, I think the whole premise of having a United Nations and indeed having a human rights system is that we are all connected, and that while nations, of course, are sovereign, there are also limits, and there are also ways in which each other's actions affect one another, and this is perhaps one of those. We know that there are very serious violations going on in North Korea, and we know that they do very serious harm to many people inside North Korea, but they also harm people in South Korea. We are coming up now to the 70th anniversary. We still have unresolved issues around prisoners of war, around separated families, around disappearance cases from South Korea, but also elsewhere. So the human rights issues, including that related to freedom of speech, but also to freedom to access information inside North Korea, are deeply connected to many of the other difficult issues that the Korean Peninsula is facing.
I mean, I want to get on to the situation about human rights within North Korea in just a second, but I do want to talk more about this leaflet issue, because I wanted to ask, how effective are the leaflet campaigns in terms of improving the situation in North Korea? Critics of the campaigns will argue that they're not particularly effective, that there are more effective targeted ways to reach North Korean people, and all these leaflets do is anger the regime, cause pollution and possibly even endanger the lives of South Koreans near the border?
Yeah, it's very difficult to know how effective they are. And the reason it's so difficult is because we don't have access to North Korea. We get some news from North Korea, but usually the version that's given by the state-run agencies. There is no freedom of the media. There is no freedom of people to express their thoughts or what they think. So it's very difficult indeed to measure exactly what the impact is. But the options also for talking to people in North Korea are very limited. And this is back to my previous point about, we really need to have, I think, a broad-based discussion of what is the best way to approach North Korea. And I think over different times, different strategies for that have been tested and tried. And to have an inclusive debate and dialogue on that is extremely important, I think.
Professor, if we stick with the situation here in South Korea and what these defector groups are doing, do you think they are potentially disrupting the Moon Jae-in's peace process? But do you think they should perhaps be left to do what they do, or are they endangering the peace process?
Well, as I said, I think they were just North Korea's just been looking for a reason to have a crisis. South Korea government has to look like it's responding to North Korea's protests. And so it is a form of communication, it is a form of dialogue, insofar as the South Koreans are attempting to show that they are sensitive to North Korean concerns. But it's I think part of the broader context of the worsening crisis in North Korea, with which we don't really have concrete data on, but given that, for example, how much they were reliant upon Chinese tourism, that's been shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is probably worsening situation in North Korea. That even before the pandemic, there was concerns about the ability of the North Korean medical system to deal with infectious diseases before the COVID-19. So I think the South Korean approach is perhaps appropriate, that they are responding, that they are trying to balance these conflicting imperatives and pressures, including human rights and right to free, information and communication, while also recognizing that this is a war zone. And it was still in a ceasefire situation, and while trying to maintain a world awareness and focus on that issue through the UN and other organizations like the United European Union and Moscow and Beijing and Tokyo as well. Keep the dialogue going, whatever it takes. Keep the dialogues going.
Let's move on to the human rights situation in North Korea now, because the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted another resolution condemning human rights violations by North Korea, and it was for the 18th consecutive year now. However, Seoul did not co-sponsor the document. Do you think the human rights concerns are perhaps overshadowed under the current administration here in South Korea? Do you have concerns about that, Ms. Poulsen?
I don't think it's a matter of human rights concerns being overshadowed. I think it's a matter of South Korea's position on how they want to address and approach this area. And certainly, in general, we hope that all countries will support the international efforts towards, improving the human rights situation inside North Korea and working with North Korea and, like you said, engaging and talking to North Korea in a dialogue that includes human rights as well. And I think it's also well understood that South Korea in the international community holds a particular position vis-à-vis North Korea.
Professor, moving forward, how do you think Seoul needs to work with North Korea and resolve these issues? And at the same time, can they do it while trying to improve the human rights conditions in North Korea as well?
Well, I think this Track 2 diplomacy approach Ms. Poulsen is highlighting is very important. I mean, but there are a number of NGOs that have been active in North Korea for years, humanitarian relief NGOs. Here in Seoul, even relatively conservative institutions like churches, Presbyterian churches have been involved in setting up the Pyongyang Institute of University of Science and Technology. Can work with those, continue to pursue those other non-governmental organizations that already have connections and activities in North Korea, and channel civil society activity in that direction. While for national security reasons, restricting the activities of these NGOs that are engaged in the balloon leaflet efforts.
And Ms. Poulsen, how do you think South Korea should do to try and resolve the situation going forward as well?
I think it's very important that the communication with North Korea and between North Korea and the international community, be it South Korea or other countries, continues. And in order to have such a continuation, and it's also very important that human rights is included in that, whether it be on the separated families issue or on other issues. And so that's one thing. It's also important that we do in those cases and in those situations where very serious violations are really taking place in North Korea, and we are talking, for example, in the prison system, but also in humanitarian areas like access to food, that we talk to North Korea about their obligation as a member state of the United Nations to secure its own population certain basic rights, whether it's enough food or decent conditions within detention. So all of those initiatives, I think, can be pursued at the same time.
We'll have to leave it there. We've been speaking to Ms. Signe Poulsen from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Seoul. We've also been speaking to Professor Benedict DeDominicis from the Catholic University of Korea. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.